Okay, right, all the young people, please come back. This is your class. The young people. Right, good morning. Just now when Andy was talking about the young being defined as 35 and below, I heard Jin Kai say that 53 and 35 is about the same. So there are quite a lot of us who are 53, okay? So we qualify. Compared to infinity. All right, the title for my lesson today is to have eyes that see. Right, today's lesson is a result of a couple of questions that I asked when I was reading one of the familiar passages in the Bible. So I started reading what some people have said about this, and then I thought about the nature of faith and also how deliberate Jesus was in the way he instructed his disciples. All right, so I hope that the lesson today will help each of you in a unique way. The passage is based on one of Jesus' healings, and we know that Jesus healed many people. Some of them were blind, and but this one sticks out, okay, which I'm sure you will agree with me, okay. Mark chapter 8, verses 22 to 26. They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged Jesus to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him outside the village. When he had spit on the man's eyes and put his hands on him, Jesus asked, "Do you see anything?" He looked up and said, "I see people. They look like trees walking around." Once more, Jesus put his hands on the man's eyes. Then his eyes were opened. His sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Jesus sent him home, saying, "Don't even go into the village." We'll stop there. This account is only found in the book of Mark, not in the other Gospels. Very concise, as typical of the writing in Mark's Gospel, but packed with curious actions of Jesus. I thought this morning we could make this a little interactive, right? Taking the example from Andy. Shall we?
Yeah.
So as you were reading this, what were some questions that crossed your mind? Just shout out from where you are. What are some questions that came to your mind?
Why you speak?
Why you spit? Yeah, right. You. Yeah, okay. Yes, what else?
Why you just say Jesus that performs miracle is not clear cut that make a man see straight away from himself?
Right. It's a progressive two-stage kind of a healing, right? This is the only account of Jesus healing that is two-stage. That's right. Good question. What else?
Why is it so? Like, was the man like sighted and then blind, or was he like blind from birth? Because like the word there
Right.
is
Right. Restoring has this idea of like, right, he has sight before, not born blind, right? John chapter 9, he healed another man who was born blind. So this one seems like, it's he had sight before, okay? Right, good question, good observation. Anything else? Why was it in private, right? Yeah, I mean, that's like, why not in front of everyone? Why bring him outside the village? Right? Anything wrong with the village? Bethsaida, yes. Good question, okay? I won't have answers to all these questions, okay? So we're gonna have to be able to discuss. But I can give some insight as to Bethsaida was one of the three towns that Jesus, was not very happy with. He said Tyre and Sidon, they are actually, it will be more bearable for Tyre and Sidon than Bethsaida, Chorazin, and Capernaum, right? Three of the cities. Anything else? Right. Why was the blind man instructed not to go back to the village, right? Okay. So all these are good questions, okay? In fact, similar to many questions that I had also when I was reading this account, okay? But the main question, like I said, I don't have answers to every question, okay? We can discuss, you can look it up, and we can all have a good discussion about it. But I will try and answer the third one, which I thought is perhaps the most interesting question. Not that the others are not interesting, but because I don't wish the lesson to go on and on and on, okay, we can always discuss. So why a two-stage healing? One of the main explanations for this question comes from reading the account in context, meaning we should read before and after the event. Now, whether the events are chronological, we cannot be sure, but Mark is trying to tell a story, so he probably wanted the readers to understand something. Okay, that's why he arranged them that way. They probably are chronological, as some scholars said, but perhaps not immediately following one after another. Okay, maybe there are some events that happen in between, but usually recounts are like that, right? I mean, you don't recall every single thing, and sometimes deliberately, sometimes because you just cannot remember the details. And that's what inspiration is all about. Okay, they are really not devoid of the prophet's own thoughts. I used to think that God inspires prophets by zapping them with thoughts they never had before, and then force them to think a certain way or even behave a certain way. He could do that for sure, okay, but I don't think that's his usual way. And if he does that, what's the difference between that and creating robots who don't have their own will and who only does his bidding? We, on the other hand, might want to do that. Okay, we like to force people to do things against their will because we are sinful. But God is not like that. He's a lot more gentle, like what Andy said, a lot kinder. He gives us agency and our own will. He may gently whisper to us in our thoughts, and then these thoughts can mingle with our own thoughts. Some of them would agree with God's, but others may be totally opposite. And God allows us to sift through the thoughts to identify what's good and what's not. We get to choose which ones to listen to and which ones to silence. That's discernment and wisdom. That's why reading God's word is so important. The more we read the scriptures, the more clearly we will identify what is from God and what is from our own sinful selves. And that's probably also why it is important to engage in the discipline of silence. It is when we are quiet that we get to hear God's whispers. When I fill my thought life with all kinds of voices, it's no wonder that all that noise will drown out God's voice. Quiet time is not just thinking our own thoughts. Quiet time is a good time to listen out for God's voice. So, that's a very long preamble, somewhat related to my main point. But before we start to explain the reason for the two-stage healing by reading the context, let's first talk about what it cannot be. Okay? Firstly, it cannot be Jesus not having sufficient power to heal the man immediately. In Chinese, we call that 不够功力, right? Because this is the same Jesus who could heal immediately, even from a distance, without having seen the person. You can read about that in chapter 7 in the same book, where he healed the Syrophoenician woman's daughter without even her being in front of him, right? The woman came to him and he healed the daughter from a distance. And then there are other accounts of him healing from a distance. right? John chapter 4, healing of a centurion's son, and in Matthew 8, where he healed another centurion's servant. So it cannot be Jesus lacked power, right? Then could it be that the blind man lacked faith? After all, there are passages recording that Jesus didn't heal because of lack of faith. I could think of Mark 6, where Jesus healed, he was teaching in his own hometown. And the Bible says that he could not heal apart from just a few people. And and Mark chapter 9, where Jesus healed a man's son when his disciples could not. Mark 6, he did not heal because of lack of faith. And the reason was that the people in his hometown rejected him. They had already decided who he was because he grew up in the same hometown. So is it any wonder that he did not heal anyone except to lay hands on a few sick people? Why give something to someone who cannot even appreciate it? They probably didn't even think that his miracles were authentic because Jesus was too ordinary for them. He was just one of them. He not healed because they did not come to him and because they didn't even think that he could do anything for them. Mark 9, his disciples tried to heal a man's son unsuccessfully because they did so without prayer, the Bible says. That means they were trying to do God's work using their own human strength. So again, it's not a simple case of them not having enough faith. It was more them being humanistic. And if I dare go further, the disciples were probably starting to give themselves credit for being able to heal and cast out demons. Jesus gave them power to do so before this. So they went around casting demons and healing people. And now they think that they can do it because they were powerful on their own. So both passages, even though they talk about lack of faith, the deeper reasons are not the same. And then there are also passages that Jesus commended those who healed for their faith. Matthew 9:22, 28 to 29, and 15:28. I do not have time to go into all these passages in detail, but they certainly do not teach that Jesus or God's healing power needs our faith. Because these passages almost seem as if it's our faith that does the healing. And sometimes, many of us, including myself, we tend to think this way. So, let's talk about what faith is not before we talk about what faith is in the context of healing. What faith is not a commodity that can be used like magical power, It's not so simplistic. And if we don't really wrestle with what faith really means, we will tend to default to thinking of it in terms of how much I believe. If I believe a lot that something is going to happen, if I'm convinced that something is going to happen, then I have a lot of faith. If I doubt that it's going to happen, then I don't have much faith. That's the usual way that we think. So this kind of thinking about faith makes it a function of my level of confidence. I like to read fantasy books. Many of these, even up to this age, okay? A young age of 35. Started reading Lord of the Rings, all those fantasy books, and then I progressed to others. But many of these fantasy books have the protagonist as some weak underdog who has some potential magical power that usually doesn't get unleashed, right? I mean, for many chapters or sometimes many books, they don't get to use their power, even though they have a lot of potential. They don't get unleashed until he or she believes that she can do it or he can do it. So sometimes when we think of faith this way, if only I can have a bit more faith, bracket in myself, then I can do it. The world tells us this, and we buy into this kind of mumbo-jumbo self-help religion. When we do that, we give ourselves too much credit, because this kind of faith is way too focused on the self. Perhaps an analogy would help to make things a little clearer. Suppose you are sick and you are in need of an operation. So you go to a particular doctor to help you to get healed. You go for the operation because you have faith in the doctor and in modern medicine. But you won't for a sane moment think that you have healed yourself. The doctor healed you by operating on you. You may have taken the right step to get healed, but the credit actually goes to the doctor. At most, our faith is only an instrument by which God works, not the power itself. In other words, the value of one's faith does not come from the one who expresses it, but from the object in which it rests, in this case, God. Ultimately, healing is not dependent upon the quality of one's faith, but upon the one who heals. So, I think it's better to see faith as the confidence directed towards the character of God, because He's been good to us, and He will continue to be good to us. But His kindness is not dependent on how good we've been, or whether we've earned it with our faith. He is kind because He is God. That's who He is. Faith is believing who Jesus is and who He said He is. He loves us and He will take care of us. Thirdly, faith is knowing that Jesus wants us to have a relationship, a deep relationship with Him, and to rely on Him, and not for one moment think that we can do anything by ourselves. But I must qualify, whether He heals me when I ask Him to is really entirely up to Him, His plan and His will, because it has no bearing on His character nor His love. His love for me is not proven because He heals me, and His love for me is not absent when He does not heal me. You see, there's more to being human than our physical bodies. We are physical beings for sure, but we are also spiritual. Our hearts and our spiritual state, eternal destiny, are way more important to God. Not that He doesn't want us to be physically well, because He's the one who created the physical world in all its beauty, our amazing physical bodies included. But decay and sickness is a consequence of man's fallen state, which is the whole reason why Jesus came to redeem this world. But His redemption plan is not to heal everyone physically here and now. It is to heal us spiritually, to redeem our hearts, and to reconcile us to God. One day, we're going to have new bodies in a new earth and new heavens. But the time is not now. But I will not say that sickness and suffering is good for us. It really depends. For some of us, it makes us better people, but for others, worse. Maybe God in His eternal wisdom heals some of us of major illnesses during this lifetime, but not others. Even the Apostle Paul begged God for healing, but he was not answered, right? Are we to conclude that he did not have enough faith? In Mark chapter 5, verse 34, Jesus said to the woman who touched Him and was healed of her bleeding, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." So Jesus did not just heal her physically. He was also concerned about her spirit. So although I didn't show you this. Although Jesus did commend her and others for their faith when He healed them, He was more concerned about what the faith does to the heart or the spirit of the person, that it changes the quality of the person's relationship with God and with others. Not just what it produces in them in terms of physical healing or material well-being, because a change in a person's heart changes the person for eternity. But physical healing only changes him externally and temporarily. My favorite author, I cannot do a sermon without quoting something he said. There are far, far better things ahead than any we leave behind. C.S. Lewis said, he actually wrote this to Mary Shelburne, a lady who was thought to be dying, to encourage her. Ironically, she went on to live for another 12 years, but C.S. Lewis died 5 months later. But how beautifully he put it, that we are all built for better things. The life and the physical bodies that we have now are only but a shadow of what lies ahead of us in eternity. And I have not even talked about the instances where Jesus healed despite lack of faith for the person who was being healed. Example, John chapter 5, verses 1 to 11. Jesus asked the man if he wanted to be well, right? The man at the Bethesda. His answer was full of excuses. There was no one to carry him to the pool. He wasn't fast enough when the pool was swirling at the right time. And yet, Jesus chose him of all the people there to be healed. So this is a clear case of healing without prior condition of faith. He didn't even know who Jesus was until Jesus appeared in front of him and found him and then warned him not to sin further or he'll get worse. So, whether he came to faith or not later, I don't know, but I would like to think he did. So perhaps this blind man in Bethsaida, whether he had faith or no faith, is not even a question that we should be concerned about here. If we read the context, which we will do now, okay, we're going to find another reason that is more convincing than his lack of faith. So let's start from verse 1 in Mark chapter 8. It's quite a long passage. During those days, another large crowd gathered. So we're going to read ahead. Since they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples to him and said, I have compassion for these people. They have already been with me for 3 days and have nothing to eat. If I send them home hungry, they will collapse on the way because some of them have come a long distance. His disciples answered, but where in this remote place can anyone get enough bread to feed them? How many loaves do you have? Jesus asked. 7. They replied. He told the crowd to sit down on the ground. When he had taken the 7 loaves and given thanks, he broke them and gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people, and they did so. They had a few small fish as well. He gave thanks for them also and told the disciples to distribute them. The people ate and were satisfied. Afterward, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. About 4,000 were present. After he had sent them away, he got into the boat with his disciples and went to the region of Dalmanutha. Then the Pharisees came and began to question Jesus. To test him, they asked him for a sign from heaven. He sighed deeply and said, why does this generation ask for a sign? Truly, I tell you, no sign will be given to it. Then he left them, got back into the boat, and crossed to the other side. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread, except for 1 loaf they had with them in the boat. Be careful, Jesus warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. They discussed this with one another and said, it is because we have no bread. Aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see, and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember, when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? 12, they replied. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? They answered, 7. He said to them, do you still not understand? So these are the events of what happened immediately before he healed the blind man from Bethsaida. In fact, if you read further back, You will read that Jesus healed another man who was deaf. He also used saliva to touch his tongue, deaf and mute. And then Jesus also fed another group that was 5,000 in number. But I'll leave it to you to read these accounts. What I want to point out is, yes, Jesus did feed these people because he was compassionate and he wanted to meet their needs. But he also healed because for another reason. He was really using the miracles to teach his disciples lessons. You see, Jesus only had 3 years with them. And everything that he did also had another purpose. It was about his disciples, to teach them about him and about God's plan for them. So here's a chronology of events from Mark 6 to 8. The last two we just read, but not the first three, right? So feeding of the 5,000, healing of the Syrophoenician woman's daughter, healing of the deaf and mute man, feeding of 4,000, and finally healing of the blind man at Bethsaida. And you notice the pairing. Okay. Light. The pairing of the feeding of the 5,000 and the 4,000, as well as the deaf, mute, and the blind man. And in between, there is this healing of the Syrophoenician woman's daughter. So first, let's talk about the feeding of the 5,000 and the 4,000. Some scholars think that these are two variations of the same event. So Matthew and Mark got confused. Okay, it was found in both Matthew and Mark. It cannot be, because the numbers and the details are quite different. For instance, the locations were different. The audience, the people being fed, were two different groups of people. And the numbers are all different. So, I got this from some different scholars who compared the two. The 5,000 was in Bethsaida, near Bethsaida. So the crowd is predominantly Jewish. But the 4,000 were generally Gentiles, because it was in this region called the Decapolis, which is in 10. It means 10 cities, and most of them were the Gentiles, were non-Jews. And notice the numbers. The Jews are actually quite into numbers, and in their thinking, certain numbers have special significance. The numbers reported here may not be just factual. Some scholars say that the feeding of the 5,000 and 4,000 is really a foreshadow of the great banquet that will take place when God finally brings in his people. But like I'm showing here, there's more to be explored. The 5 represents the grace of God. 5 in the 5,000 and multiples of 5. 5 could also represent the Torah, which is the 5 books of Moses. When Moses gave the law on the 2 tablets, the 2, and 12 basketfuls left behind represents the 12 tribes of Israel. The 4,000, 4 in Hebrew thinking means, among other things, the 4 corners of the world. So reaching further than just Israel. Decapolis, okay. 7 represents completeness, because it's not just Jews but Gentiles as well. And 7 also represents the Gentile nations. Okay. The verse is not there. Okay. Oh yeah, it's there. Deuteronomy 7 verse 1. Okay, it talks about the 7 Gentile nations in the Old Testament. So the overall image is really about Jesus being the new Moses, giving sustenance physically and spiritually. And the 4,000 Gentiles were also taken care of by Jesus. Some of us may feel like all this number is stretching it a bit. Okay, maybe not. I'm certainly not advocating an unhealthy reading of the numbers. to predict end times and the second coming of Jesus. In fact, understanding the significance of numbers and symbolism in the Bible will help us to understand some apocalyptic books like Daniel and Revelation, and to steer us away from meaningless and even harmful speculation of end times. There are many sites that list similar numbers and their significance. Personally, I find these two useful. Okay, you can later on when it's sent to you, or you can scan the QR code because there are two here, and read it at your own leisure. Okay. Next, I want to talk about the significance of the Syrophoenician woman's daughter in between the two feedings. So 5,000 was the Jews, and then Jesus traveled to the region, and then the Syrophoenician woman, who was a Gentile, came to him, and this is the conversation between Jesus and her. So she wanted Jesus to heal or to cast the demon out of the daughter, and Jesus said, "First, let the children eat all they want." He told her, "For it is not right to take the children's bread and toss it to the dogs." But she said, "Lord, even the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." For such a reply, you may go, the demon has left your daughter. Jesus was referring to children as Israel. And in a parallel account in Matthew, Jesus said that he was sent only to the lost sheep of Israel. Was that the original plan? Maybe we can study this more, but I personally think that he was simply testing her. A little qualifier is needed at this point. The word dog here in its original Greek is little dog or pet or family pet. So Jesus wasn't using dog as an insult. Okay. In any case, the Jews during that time did refer to the Gentiles as dogs. So Jesus was really just using language that both his disciples and the lady understood. So it could be this event is setting the stage for the feeding of the Gentiles in the 4,000. But let us go back to Mark chapter 8. After Jesus fed the 4,000, he was on the boat to get to the other side of the lake. He warned the disciples about the yeast of the Pharisees, as we read, right? But the disciples obviously misunderstood him. They thought he was talking about not bringing bread, because yeast obviously was used for bread. And maybe Jesus was concerned about the 7 basketfuls of leftover that is not wasted, okay? That's when Jesus talked to them about having ears that cannot hear and eyes that cannot see. In fact, he asked them specifically and the precise numbers of what he used, how many loaves of bread, how many fish, how many basketfuls of food left over. Why did Jesus have to be so specific about the numbers? And he even asked them, "Do you still not understand? After looking at all these numbers." So that brings us back to the question of the 2-stage miracle. Perhaps Jesus brought the man outside the village, out of sensitivity for the man's needs, but perhaps he did it as a private lesson for his disciples. That could be one reason. It's an object lesson for the disciples. They certainly had eyes, but they cannot see. But what they saw was only partial. They were seeing men walking like trees. Jesus wanted them to learn more important things about him and about what God was doing. But they were slow in understanding. In this case, they completely misunderstood him. So I totally get why Jesus seemed quite upset with them. We can almost imagine Jesus looking at them in the eye, and then when the man could only see trees, right? Because they thought that he was concerned about bread when he was teaching them about him, that he was the bread of life. He wanted them to stay away from the Pharisees, the yeast of the Pharisees, and they thought that it was about bread. So their thinking was as ridiculous as trees walking, right? You cannot imagine trees walking. Case in point, you go back and you read the account immediately following this healing. It's about Peter acknowledging that Jesus was the Messiah. Finally, some light is coming in. But then, immediately after that, Jesus predicted that he was going to suffer many things and finally be killed in Jerusalem. Then Peter took him aside and rebuked him. The nerve to rebuke the master, right? Which earned him in return the stiffest rebuke Jesus has given anyone till then, right? Jesus called him Satan. So this object lesson, having eyes yet not seeing, is one that Peter remembered in his own growth. Remember, this is the book of Mark. Mark was a disciple of Peter, or at least Peter was the leader leading at the church at that time. So Mark was actually retelling Peter's story. So this is Peter's own words of him getting rebuked by Jesus for having eyes but not see. You know, I find Peter's story and the disciples' story to also be my story. I've been a Christian for more than 30 years now. I'm quite ashamed to say that sometimes my vision of Jesus and his plan for the world and for my life is quite blurred and very foggy. Not that God is not clear in his teachings. Jesus is certainly quite deliberate about making things simple for us. He summarized his teaching in 2 simple commands: love God and love my neighbor. And then he left clues all over from the beginning of history, okay, and also in multiple places in my life. But I've been quite dense and slow in understanding. Mostly because I don't pray enough, like the disciples, and also maybe I don't rely on God enough. I also fill my life with too many things that don't really matter. And when God tells me things, often through things that happen in my life or through whispering in my conscience, I completely ignore them. Sometimes I tell myself, what is the big deal? I only forgot the bread. But I'm also thankful that Jesus did not leave the man partially blind like that and stop at the first stage. Jesus touched him again and he was able to see. He might have rebuked Peter, but this same confused Peter went on to deliver the clearest and the greatest sermon about Jesus at Pentecost. He also died to fulfill his master's plan. And all the disciples, except for one, were also killed for their faith. Past 2 years have been pretty confusing, to say the least, in my spiritual life. And I can probably extend that to many of us. But I think God is slowly opening my eyes to his will in my life. For the past decades of my life, I've been wandering around quite blindly and then leading other blind people. God forgive me. But then I begin to see men walking around like trees. Maybe some of you still look like trees to me, especially when I take out my glasses. I think about Cleopas and his companion who were traveling along the road to Emmaus. And then they met the resurrected Jesus, but they could not recognize Jesus. I used to think that it's because Jesus had a different resurrected face, you know. His body is different. He's now more handsome after he resurrected. That prevented them from recognizing him. But now I think it's because they were slow in understanding and they were blinded by foolishness, as Jesus said about them. Their disbelief made them unable to recognize their Lord. Maybe some of us can see God more clearly today than in our younger days, and we're thankful. Maybe we're still seeing trees walking around, but it's all right. Be patient, because Jesus will help us to see him clearly if we let him. And when he does that, I think the first person we will see will be Jesus, his kind and his welcoming face. Thank you. I have some discussion questions which you may like to take a photo of, because this week we're going to have a discussion based on some of these questions, okay? And other questions that you might have. And yeah, we'll do this with the campus group later also. Thank you. Okay, looks like the others are not back yet. Yeah, let's break up for a good time of fellowship and wait for the rest to come. Then we'll sing a song together. Thank you. Yes. One more point. What's this? Oh, my shirt. My shirt.
Good job.
Thank you.